OMG, Politics in the Name of Heaven. So it promises to be quite interesting. I'm going to introduce all the panelists. Each of them will have 10 minutes to speak to you about the topic. That will equal 40 minutes. Then we'll have 20 minutes of them talking amongst themselves, and then we'll have 20 minutes of audience questions. So our first panelist is Chip Burleigh. Chip is an investigative journalist and photographer who has been documenting social and political movements that undermine human rights, and he's been doing this for decades. He's received awards for his work on behalf of human rights and against racism and bigotry. Our second panelist, and it's going to go in a different order than we're seated, is Peter Morales. Peter is president of the Unitarian Universalist Association, its first Latino president, and he acts as principal spokesperson for that organization. He's a veteran participant in nonviolent civil disobedience. Our third panelist will be Heather Hurlburt. Heather is currently the executive director of the National Security Network. I think she'll maybe explain a little bit about what that is. She joined that network in 2002, and before that had her own firm working in communications and strategy practice on an international level with many important people, including President Clinton. And finally, Ike Wilson. Ike is a graduate of West Point and a combat veteran. He's a thinker on organizational politics, civil-military relations, and national security, and currently is an associate professor with the Department of Social Sciences at West Point. So welcome to all of you, and we'll ask Chip to start.
OMG, well, LMAO. The issue for me is clear. I'm both a practicing Christian and a socialist, multi-democrat socialist, democratic socialist, and I wear my politics on my sleeve, and I don't like it when people come up to me and say, don't bring your religion into the voting booth, because how can you not if you're a religious person? That's not the issue. The issue is when any religious group or any group decides that its particular ideological worldview is going to be imposed on the rest of the society without a rational basis or compelling state interest. And I know that in Colorado, this is the state position because I came out here in 1993 as a paralegal to work on the case against Amendment 2 to have an injunction brought in front of the Supreme Court of Colorado over Amendment 2, which was a homophobic initiative, but not just homophobic. It would have essentially taken away human rights from an entire class of citizens. And democracy does not mean that you get to take away rights from anyone. We all have the same rights. There is no such thing as special rights. And rights are what we all should defend wherever we are on the political spectrum, and no matter what our spiritual, religious, or non-religious beliefs are. And so we are caught in the midst of a campaign season where people are saying that because they want to deprive people of certain rights, it is in fact they are being victimized for their religion, which turns the First Amendment on its head. Congress shall make no law doesn't mean that you get to tell other people that your religious ideology trumps the law. It does not. And I think that's really what really good people across the political spectrum should be pointing out, that if we're going to have a debate over social issues and political issues and economic issues and foreign policy issues, it best be done with arguments that we can all agree on have a fact base. And as a person of faith, faith is not fact-based. So the two can exist side by side. Religion can influence your political views, but God does not trump rational argument in the public square. Now, this is an issue because there is and has been now for a number of decades a movement of the Christian right across a broad range of different theologies and positions on the end times that Fred Clarkson and I invented the word dominionism to describe it. And dominionism simply means that no matter how you read the Bible, no matter what your view of how the end times comes or doesn't come or how it comes, no matter what your position on a number of theological issues is, that Christians are mandated to take over every sector of society. And when I say that, I don't mean get elected fair and square. I mean take it over so that everyone else can be told what to do. Now, if that seems like an extreme statement, here's a comment from George Grant, some of whose books are distributed in the National Park Service. We must win the world with the power of the gospel, but the Christian politics has its primary intent the conquest of the land of men, families, institutions, bureaucracies, courts, and governments for the kingdom of Christ. Not just influence, it is dominion we are after. Not just equal time, it is dominion we are after. World conquest. Now, he's not a marginal figure in the Christian right. And I would like to point out that this scares me a bunch, because I have no problem with bringing religion into the voting booth, but I have a real problem with turning over the idea of our founders, as flawed as they were, that no one religious viewpoint would triumph or trump our political life or our social life in the United States. And whether or not this has an outcome, I need only point to the constant harping over the last 20 years about abortion and gay rights, which has resulted in some people deciding it is appropriate to kill people, to bomb buildings, to do a whole range of activities that are illegal. I do think that rhetoric has an outcome. I do think that when people are demonized and vilified, and that basically it is said that these are the people that are holding back the society, they want to undermine everything we stand for, it creates a dynamic which I call the tools of fear. And you demonize and vilify, then you scapegoat, then you say, if they're planning to go get us and destroy our ideal community, it justifies anything we can do to take over and stop them. So it's a preemptive strike that's based on an imaginary idea that gay people want to take over the world, or abortion on demand to be able to go, get your bathing suit fitted. All of these myths are wrapped around conspiracies, which go all the way up to conspiracies about the President of the United States, who, in some circles within the Christian right and the patriot right, Obama is still openly called the Muslim president, the person who does not deserve to be in office. And all of these then stories that get told about what's going on in America that only live in the subculture of the Christian right. If democracy is based on informed consent, the idea that liberalism and gay rights and women's rights are all part of a plot that started with Dewey and public education to brainwash children to reject their parents and reject God, then of course there is no compromise. There's no political compromise with evil. If you think your enemy is indeed an agent of Satan, as a person of faith, why would you compromise with Satan? And outside of the mainstream media, this is a steady diet being pushed out through direct mail, on radio programs, from pulpits. And don't for a moment think that it's not happening just because you don't hear it. It's happening in these information silos. So my worry is, oh my God, politics and religion in the current campaign is that there's a whole millions of people who are existing in this campaign with a set of conspiracy theories that demonizes a whole range of people. And when they vote against Obama, which they will, they are voting for God and against Satan. And I don't think that's a very good outcome for democracy in America.
Thank you, Chip. And Peter, you're next.
Thank you. The issue for me of politics and religion is very complicated because as I look at the role that religion has played in politics nationally and even across borders, it's a very mixed bag. On the one level, it's hard to imagine in this country some of the progress that we've made without the role of the black church. For example, I mean, it was the incubator for the civil rights movement. It was a leadership training site for so many people. So there's that aspect. Looking beyond our borders, there's been for example, in much of Latin America, the influence of liberation theology, of a sense that Christian people have a responsibility for the poor, that there is a predisposition toward the poor. So on the one level, religion has encapsulated some of our most utopian dreams and become a vehicle for expressing those. And we just heard about the other side, or part of the other side. Another role that religion has always played, think back to Rome and Greece and everywhere. Religion has played a tremendous role in legitimizing the existing power structures throughout history. It has been a very conservative or reactionary force in many societies, whether it's the divine right of kings. If you look at India and reinforcing a rigid caste structure, and that has influence today. So it's not as easy as saying that the involvement of religion in politics is a good thing, or the involvement of religion in politics is a bad thing. I'm sorry. So it's not as easy as saying that it's a good thing or a bad thing. It's a very, very mixed bag. What I believe we need to do in this country, there are a couple of things, is to reinforce the separation of church and state. And that does not mean separating core religious values like compassion, mutual responsibility from our behavior as citizens. But one of the things that scares me to death as well is the kind of strident, self-righteous quality of the participation of the religious right. I think it should concern us all. But the solution is to get to a level where people in the middle and more progressive people are insisting and consciously advocating policies that are grounded in their core religious values. And I believe that in all of the main religious traditions there is that respect for individual human dignity, that is as these things, and in a sense that we are all in this together, and that we are responsible for one another. And I would love it if more of those kinds of values found expression in public policy. So I'll end my remarks with that. I mean, the question is around religious values and how they get in, separation of church and state, and the very complex nature and role that religion can be a force for horrible conflict, and it can be a liberating force, and it's us to choose how we use it.
Thank you, Peter. Heather will be next.
Thanks. As James said, in my day job, I run the National Security Network, which is dedicated to teaching progressives on the center-left how not to be afraid to talk about national security policy. And taking the brilliant books and scholarly articles that Ike writes and turning them into a page and a half of talking points that I can get anybody on the Hill to read. So that's my day job. I also happen to be an observant Christian married to an observant Jew, so as we say, we do a lot of observing in our house. And I want to actually talk a little bit about a place where religion is being used in our politics in a way that comes out of the far-right silos that you spoke about, but that is seeping in and is really changing the way, or threatens to change the way, the moderate middle, and even, frankly, the left, thinks about international affairs without having any idea that that's where it's coming from. And this, of course, starts with the fact that it's now been 10 and a half years since 9/11, and an awfully large part of the US citizenry is under the impression that we are at war with terrorism, as many times as Ike tries to tell them you can't go to war with a tactic. although there was at first, and by President Bush, some commendable effort to separate that from American Muslims and from global Islam, let's say the people who worked for President Bush tended not to have gotten the memo. And what we saw in the subsequent years, and something that I think the left and progressive people of faith completely failed to understand and completely failed to react to, was that there had already been, for years, and for reasons that you alluded to, a quiet movement of folks going around not just to extreme far-right churches, but to very mainstream denominations, and giving little presentations about how scary Islam is and the dangers of Sharia law being implemented in Colorado, and how Islam isn't a real religion. And that fascinatingly, when you do public polling, one of the things people are most concerned about with respect to Islam is that it takes away women's rights, which is touching because I don't normally experience that much of the citizenry being that concerned about my rights. So, the other thing that shows you how normally we tend to assume, oh, people just don't understand X because they don't know about it. Well, in fact, in the US public, the more you know about Islam, the more afraid of it you're likely to be. Because you will so the pollsters that we worked with thought they would do some really clever things like, do you know that Muhammad is the prophet of Islam? And if you know that, it's probably because you know it because you were taught it in Sunday school. And you were taught it in Sunday school because you needed to worry about it. So what has been going on really turns on its head quite a bit of what we thought we knew about how to do interfaith dialogue and how to reduce prejudice and anxiety among religions in America. And frankly, this happened at the same time that I have to say interfaith dialogue fell a little bit out of fashion. That everyone who's of a certain age has been there, done that already, and everyone got a little tired of it, and the funders got tired of funding it, and there's sort of only so many seders you can have, and only so many times that the Christians say, why don't you have lamb at your seder? Yeah, that's an inside joke. So we on the left, and we in the non-extreme faith communities were really left unarmed against this. And I think we have to say to ourselves a little bit on the left that the discomfort that folks on the left tend to have with someone who gets up and starts his presentation saying what you said, and saying, no, I'm not leaving my religion out of the ballot box, thank you very much. The degree of discomfort that we on the left have with that has been a real handicap in our effort to respond to the way minority religions are now being demonized in America. And I'll just add to that, we have now this debate going on about whether our president is a real Christian or not. Our president is a thoughtful, progressive Christian who wrestles with all the same dilemmas that everybody who either is a person of faith or has at one time been a person of faith wrestles with them in a very sophisticated way that, even my militant atheist friends at least think is interesting. And yet you get into this primary where you have 3 different Republican candidates debating whether he's a bad Christian or not a Christian at all, and you don't hear a lot of people speaking up to defend him. And our community has such a problematic, ambivalent relationship with faith, for the reasons that Peter said, that faith is both we think of faith as both a good and bad force in politics. Well, we don't really have any choice. It's not going away. It's central to people's lives. And frankly, it's even more central to many people's lives in many parts of the world that we're now trying to figure out how on earth to deal with. So if we cut ourselves off from everyone who understands that as a perspective, we're going to have a much harder time dealing with the rest of the world. So there's a very pragmatic reason for those of us on the left to adopt a slightly more thoughtful and open approach toward faith and toward this discomfort of how to live with both faith and reason in our lives than we've had up to now. I want to say a few words about the politics of Islam in the United States, because I think this is really important for us. You may have noticed that the only foreign policy issue that we've heard about in the presidential election for the last 8-10 months is Iran. That fight's not about Iran. And it's not even really about Israel. That is a fight that is set up to remind you over and over again that we have a president with a funny Muslim name. that we have a president with a funny Muslim name who's not really one of us. And he wants to negotiate with bad guys, which isn't, he doesn't understand the threat that Israel is under. He doesn't get it. Then you link that back home to the question of, well, why would Muslims complain if they're being surveilled at colleges? If this university were in New York City, very likely Muslim students here would have been under surveillance by the New York Police Department. But if they weren't doing anything wrong, they don't have anything to worry about, right? And after all the 9/11 attackers were Muslim, remember? So you get this level of attack going on, and it doesn't have to be far-right crazy people. It just has to be people who are sitting home, who are scared, who are constantly scared again and again by what's on their television. And maybe one day somebody came to their church and gave a presentation about Islam that, wasn't very nice. And so those folks have that implanted in their minds. We've seen this in political campaigns over and over, where in Iowa, somebody thought it was a useful way to run for Congress to accuse the incumbent of being a Muslim lover. Oh boy. Now, the good news is that gentleman, the candidate who did that, lost. The other good news is that there was a candidate in Northern Virginia where they tried the same thing. Now, Northern Virginia has a significant Muslim population, and the local American Muslim leaders say, actually, those ads backfired and convinced a lot of American Muslims to vote who might not otherwise have voted. So we've got some good stories to tell about how this kind of bigotry and scaremongering actually doesn't work in American politics, but frankly, there's no guarantee it's going to stay that way. And while I think we're all very focused on the culture wars and the things that we see the extreme right doing, we need to recognize, as long as we are in this very challenging dialogue with the Islamic world, the way that the forces of religion and politics are intertwining to limit our options. And the rest of the world sees this too, by the way. And Al-Qaeda's propagandists see this, and they write blog posts that say, yeah, sure, now America says it's welcoming to Muslims, but they're going to throw you out just like they did to the Japanese. And, do we really want to hand, even if you're a militant atheist who doesn't care about religion at all, do you really want to hand those people that kind of a victory? Do you really want to be that kind of a society? So when I think about religion and politics, that's what I think about.
And Ike Wilson is our next presenter. Ike?
Great, thank you. Great to be back on a religion and politics panel as a military guy. I was here, I think Chip and I shared a real fire and brimstone conversation with Josh Rushing, I think 2 years ago, interestingly enough, over at Old Main Chapel. Amazing. What we did then, or at least what I tried to do was, as part of my presentation then, was to kind of just raise some awareness of how these, what I call a resecularization of otherwise secular politics domains of public policy, how that had basically raised attention to how that has not only happened, as my colleagues have better than I could ever do, laid out in terms of the domestic arenas, but what I wanted to show, unfortunately, is that if Houston, we have a problem in that domain, the domestic political realm, we're also seeing and have been witnessing over the last 20 years with an acceleration of it over the last 10 in military and humanitarian operations. And so this is having a dramatic impact, and I would offer a starkly negative impact on the conduct of intervention, use of force, military and civilian, and not only the conduct of the behavior, but in the conduct, but also negatively impacting on the accomplishment of the mission success or failure. So what I wanted to do is, I kind of tackle these issues from, first and foremost, a soldier and a citizen. So I'm going to share with you some of the things I've seen and had to tackle with as a soldier in the field and as a military and strategic planner conducting military humanitarian operations. But I also tackle this as a researcher, as a scholar, and I'm an Americanist and also a scholar of policy science. So I look at this issue from those 3 or 4 different angles and try to reconcile them. I don't know if I'll be successful in the reconciliation of them, but I'm just going to lay out some stuff just to scare the hell out of us all. And with that, now since I'm audio and video taped today, I am an active duty military officer, and I'm speaking to you as a citizen, one of your soldiers, but I'm not, these are my personal opinions, and I'm not representing officially any DOD, Department of the Army, West Point, et cetera, no agency. I'm not representing any official position. This is all me. Let me start here, and I'll let the academic come out of me at first. I will take us back 500 plus years. 1648 Treaty of Westphalia. I think we're familiar. I'm not going to belabor the point, but I would say we should reflect back 500 plus years and consider why the princes and kings in princely and kingly states relegated interstate affairs to a secular affair back in 1648. One of the major outcomes that came from that treaty, which is a series of treaties, was an agreement among the princes and kings that international affairs and interaction between states was going to be attempt was going to be made to keep that a secular, non-religious affair. Does anyone know why? Because they had just survived the 30 Years' War, which was the last 30 of 100 years of wars of religion. What the treaty established was that we started to establish physical territorial sovereignty. And so a sovereign state, a princely state, a kingly state that eventually evolves into territorial states and into what we know and live with today, the nation-state structure. It established an internal and inside domain where religion was relegated to, with a lot of other formerly interstate, international actors, religion being one of them. They relegated the play and the degree of play of religion and religious organizations to the determination of secular princes and kings, secular authority. That's for a representative democracy of the modern 21st century. That's our constitutional government. The degree to which, if at all, religion had a role in that internal society was give to Caesar what is Caesar's. It was an attempt to limit international relations, trade, warfare primarily, to secular, interest-based political discourses by other means, as Clausewitz would put it, the military theorist. Largely to try to get a limit on the propensity for war and the particular character that tends to come out from religious-based wars. High spiking out degrees of violence and carnage as you compare them with other interest-based wars. So we're trying to leave the world of rights-based conversations and deliberations and warfare to an interest base. When you're talking about interest, there's room for compromise. I think as Chip laid out domestically, we see the same thing play out domestically. When it's about rights, whether it's divine right of kings, as God's representative on the earth, little room for compromise because you're representing godliness, and this is absolutism, right? I would offer that, unfortunately, over the last 20 years, we've actually had a heavy hand, the United States leading a community of democracies, of democratic Western liberal nation states. We've actually had, I'll be fair and say, more unwittingly than not, had a very heavy hand in unraveling, opening the box, and in some cases, releasing that old school player called religion back into international affairs. Equally, and I find more cases of the fact that the secular states in secular interest have actually gone inside the safe haven and sanctuary of the internal space that religion was regulated to. So you have if you follow the metaphor of our Constitution with this wall or hedge of separation, you have a double bind, a double worry. You have religion, the box opening up, the concertina wire being taken off of the top of the wall, if you will, of separation of church and state, not politics and religion, mind you. That's up for the secular state to decide what that relationship is, what that marriage is. But you have religion coming out on its own accord, through missionary work, through an increase, what we see over the last 20 years, in what the sociologists call an NGOization of religious missions, right? So it's hard to distinguish. These ain't our grandparents' religious missionaries anymore. They're hybrid non-governmental organizations. They're hybrid political or secular organizations married up with faith-based and faith-saturated organizations, and it's a kind of a forgive the language, wicked combination. in terms of the outcomes that come from these behaviors. But you also have the secular state going inside, crossing in and pulling religion out. Constitutionally, it leaves me with some concerns. And one thing I would say, I'll give kind of my bottom line kind of in the middle here. We need to, a lot of this is coming from ignorance, and if we're a democratic republic, not to know its own constitution, or only to know the Constitution from a cherry-picking perspective. We know the parts we like, we know the stanzas we like that serve our purposes, but we don't read. It was particularly, let's just focus quickly on 2 points in the Bill of Rights, right? Which is really a Bill of Liberties, right? A lot of the framers and founders really left us with some confusions. We call it an establishment clause in the First Amendment, but it's really talking about non-establishment, right? But there are two clauses to the non-establishment clause, if you follow me on that for a moment. First, it's non-establishment, so that we can provide a marketplace of ideas that provide religious liberty and freedom for all. It's that toleration thing, right? You don't establish, you don't politicize, you don't institutionalize any particular faith. You don't declare one the national religion, right? So that it's a free market, a free marketplace of ideas and faiths. But along with that, so it's non-establishment, it's also free exercise. This so-called wall or hedge of separation that poor Thomas Jefferson gets beat about the head and shoulders more often today than not, it was as much or more, frankly, it was more about protecting religion from government, right? And so when we open up that and we find religion, we start to politicize and institutionalize religion, those who really feel solidly about preserving the freedom of their faith should really keep it in safe haven and sanctuary, like those princes and kings did at the international level. We ourselves as human beings, if we really care about it, the things I care most about I keep very close to my heart and I keep private. When I share it out there, I make it a public issue. When you make it a public issue in our form of government, the obligation on another one of these amendments to our Constitution, the 14th Amendment, kicks in as a requirement. Once I make that private thing called my faith and I want to declare it for everyone else, publicly, the government now has a role to weigh in and regulate it just like any other organization, out of a necessity for living up to its obligations of equal protection under the law, which would include preserving the equal protection of those of we might call non-faith believers, to not have to be receiving public services to include national security through your military operations, conditional, because it's being serviced through a faith-based organization. I'll end with some things that scare me and just kind of, like I said, give you some ideas of what's going on in the sphere of military humanitarian operations, and I'll stop. As we see this what I call a faith saturation of international affairs and military humanitarian operations, here's some things that we start to see. We're seeing an increase in death rates among humanitarian workers, anywhere from 200 to 800% increase in incident rates. Now, Docs Without Borders contacted me and a few other folks at West Point about 4 or 5 years ago, maybe 6, really troubled with, because they were having a hard time figuring out why the 4 pillars of humanitarianism, independency, neutrality, impartiality, and humanity, why that was no longer working as well as it once did to allow them to meet mission and also have protection of their service providers. And I said, well, there's a lot of factors, but one is probably because some of the organizations that you're working through are no longer pure missionaries, they're actually religious-based NGOs. And so they've actually become a political strategic instrument of states. And so they've lost their veil. They've lost their veil of impartiality. That's part one. That's one of the problems. You see an increase in the incidence of self-identification among your military, and I focus particularly on the officer corps, as declaring their faith in a high incident of declarations of Protestant evangelicals in the military. Core to the faith is a bringing others to the word. When that plays out among your unit, among the soldier corps, transmitted by the officers, when that follows us forward in missions, and where have we been over the last 10 years, folks, in military humanitarian operations? We've been in the Middle East and in the Arab Islamic world, right? So should we really be surprised that we get declarations from time to time from entities like the Taliban saying, any Westerner we see, we're going to decapitate, take off your hands, take off your feet? And it's usually in response to one of our activities of, I'm not drawing a causal correlation here, but there is interesting harmony here, perhaps. These declarations and these activities tend to come in the wake of incidents like translating King James Bibles by the military, led by the chaplaincy, into Pashto and Dari. And as you're on missions, conducting population-centric coin, you're passing out the King James Bible, right, in a Muslim society, right? And at the same time, we're saying that we're not proselytizing, that this has nothing to do with religious issues. You see this with our defense industry, where some of the rifle scopes that were delivered in the early years of the Afghan and Iraq wars actually had King James Bible quotations engraved on the scopes. The military didn't even realize that it was going on until the enemy started picking up and capturing some of these weapons. They see this and say, oh, this is a crusade after all. Let's change the manner of our behavior, of our counteraction to the actions. And again, you get the fatwas, you get the, we're going to decapitate, take off the hands, take off the feet. Recently, mishandling, a sin of commission or omission, maybe a mix of both, a mishandling of Islamic religious articles abroad, directly resulting in the last incident of 9 U.S. NATO soldiers being killed in dramatic fashion. And at the same time, 2 years prior, statements made, I can't remember the individual down in Florida who was calling for it on the internet for a day of burning Quran. Well, that resulted in the loss of, there's a rhythm to that between that and about a week later, loss of 4 soldiers. Well, and the Taliban declared that that's the reason why they killed those particular soldiers. So you see how this starts to creep in and really change the architecture of us in terms of the change of behavior. Last quick points. We have to remember America is a nation born between the Great Awakening and the Enlightenment. And so ours as a nation, and what our founders and framers tried to give us, was a marriage between biblical values and Enlightenment ideals. And the way they did that was through the Constitution. They did it with both sides, both parts of each stanza of the Bill of Rights, the Bill of Liberties, a non-toleration and a free exercise. It takes both of them. That is the full amendment. That is the full article. And it's more about a shared power of the people through separate institutions. It is religion and politics assured effectively through an effective separation of church and state. And so I'll leave it at that.
So who on the panel would like to comment?
The idea of the sacralization of politics comes from a scholar named Emilio Gentili, and it has to do with the argument that, and it goes to how this chases away the ability to compromise, which is the nature of politics, is that if you take something that is a political struggle and you raise it to the measure of an absolute God-ordained issue, that it suddenly is non-negotiable. And therefore, there is no political solution. There is only confrontation. And that this whole theory, which is related to apocalyptic thinking and the ideas of palingenesis or heroic rebirth, for America to be reborn, we have to cleanse us from the sins of homosexuality and abortion. And so then issues like gay marriage and reproductive rights for women become issues of whether or not you're going to act in accordance with God or challenge God. And that's not a democracy then.
I'd like to add that I think we too often make the mistake of seeing conflict across religious traditions, Christian, Jew, Muslim. And the real conflict is more often between the most reactionary fundamentalist parts of those religions and the more progressive and open parts of them. There's really not a problem in relations across the more progressive parts of Islam, Christianity, and Judaism. The real problem is with those who are very rigid, who believe that there is a truth. The truth is in this book as interpreted by these people.
Right.
Frankly, the other thing we do is we put religious labels on conflicts because we're lazy, and then that becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. Ancient ethnic hatreds, which is kind of code for religious difference, when often conflicts are about money, power, and resources. And then religion is a convenient organizing principle. I wanted to make one comment that draws together something Ike said and something Chip said, and then ask Ike a question. For me, one of the things that was most horrible about the recent series of events in Afghanistan that began with the horribly misguided decision to burn some Qurans on the edge of a U.S. military base was that not only did that happen, not only did it lead to a cycle of violence in which American lives were lost and a lot of other lives were lost too, but then we had a political cycle here of criticizing, and it started out with criticizing our political leadership and then moved on to criticizing our military leadership for apologizing. And that we have now, because of the dynamics that you talked about, we have now gotten to a point where people think it's actually a smart political move to criticize the US commander in Afghanistan for apologizing for burning someone else's holy book. And that's just terrifying from a religious point of view, and it's terrifying from a practical politics point of view. It's just, from a counterinsurgency point of view, it's just stupid. You can't possibly conduct counterinsurgency. So the sacralization of our politics, if you will, is really chipping away at our ability to be effective international actors. And I think the majority of the public that wouldn't support the kind, that doesn't believe, it doesn't adopt end time theology, really doesn't understand that this is more than sort of a game on cable TV, and that's an enormous problem. The question, Ike, I wanted to ask you, I've never heard the increase in death rates among humanitarian workers attributed to this particular problem, and I'm wondering how you tease out, because I think it raises a more fundamental problem. There's no way the people on the ground who are on the receiving end of this can tease it out. How much have those death rates gone up because of the NGOization of religious missions, and how much have they gone up because of the intrusion of counterinsurgency operations and military force into what used to be a humanitarian domain?
Yeah, it's an unclean answer. I mean, that's the important point, though. I mean, it's only one factor. But up until really about 8 to 10 years ago, this concern with the crisis in humanitarianism was discounting one of the variables, if you will, of potential explanatory or causal variables of this rise and increase in incident of casualty rates among humanitarian workers. There was no consideration being given in the research and in the practice of this possible change in the nature, the character, and the play, if you will, of these transformed missions. And so it's one possible. Frankly, I'm still in my research unpacking it. When I'm in the field, anecdotally, you talk to folks. Sometimes you have to take what the real enemy is telling you is the cause, and again, but you have to take that with a grain of salt. I mean, that's part of their propaganda and War of Ideas campaign as well. But probably in some of that, they probably wouldn't think of that being an effective propaganda tactic against us, telling us that this is the reason why we're taking hostages and doing the decapitations and the dismemberment, if they didn't think it was effective, and it probably wouldn't be effective if there was at least some degree of incident where it was really having an instrumental effect. So it's an unclean answer. It's an excellent question, but it's something I would say we all need to look at. I would, the scholar in me comes out. There's some things that we all need to read. I've been touting, I don't know why, I don't believe in everything he writes, but Walter Russell Mead's Special Providence. And there's a particular chapter where he talks about Wilsonianism. And it's a fascinating chapter because it's something that you've never read probably. I'm confident you've never read this in any of your history books, secondary, primary, college. And it's the story of U.S. missionaries as a direct and indirect instrument of American foreign policy. It's important to go back and read that and get that part of the storyline. Again, I mean, I'm very conflicted as an American, as a spiritual person, because I'm concerned with religious freedom, but also in my concerns with religious freedom and ensuring religious freedom is through the proper institutionalization that does not establish it or anyone that would cause government rightfully and out of requirement to go in and regulate it and remove that liberty. So it's a two-way relationship, and we should all be conflicted, frankly, as Americans in that regard. But another document we all should look at is the International Religious Freedom Act, I believe originally of 1992, maybe 94, and there were revisions in 96 and 98. And with that act, there's a new energy or motor behind in giving cause, adding to the casus belli of why we use force abroad. And increasingly, part of the argument, combined with this responsibility to protect, part of the responsibility to protect through the auspices of the International Religious Freedom Act is the responsibility to protect religious organizations and people under persecution. And so on the one hand, we have the missionaries out there as an arm of U.S. foreign policy, and then when they start being seen in sacred terms and as an adversary in certain spaces, no longer humanitarian spaces, but conflict spaces, the call back to the U.S. and the international community is this is right cause to muster force, either unilaterally or collectively, on behalf of going in and prosecuting an intervention or an outright war. So this is something we have to look at in terms of the changes to this relationship that come out with the International Religious Freedom Act of again, I think it's 1994 was the first version of it. There's another book out there, I can't remember the author, but the title of the book is called The Family, and I was just introduced to this about 6 months ago. You won't be able to put it down, and you won't be able to sleep at night if you read this. But I highly encourage you to read it as citizens of the Republic, so thanks.
The Family's by Jeff Charlotte, who is a group of people who study the Christian right for many years.
I really want to jump in on the point about the International Religious Freedom Act, because this is something else that, it's a great example of how we invited, and we progressives invited religion into the public space. And one of the things that happened was this energy around doing more around AIDS and prodding both Democratic and Republican administrations to do more around AIDS. And I was very involved in this. And we deliberately thought about how can we get churches that send missionaries to Africa, but that at the same time in the US are yelling about how AIDS is the disease of the gays and they all deserve to die, but in Africa they're seeing that they're actually wrong. So there was a huge effort to get those folks more involved in the policymaking process, and it led to a wonderful thing, which was George W. Bush making a huge increase in how much money the US devoted to AIDS and to assistance in Africa, which then prompted other nations to do more. There are millions of people who are alive because we did this. But you can also draw a straight line from that advocacy to some of the advocacy that has the Coney 2012, which many of you may be familiar with, which we could have a whole nother panel talking about that. But let's just say there's a very problematic American evangelical Christian overlay to what is a genuine complex local humanitarian and conflict tragedy. And that's a great example of the box that you're talking about, that we invited religion into the public sphere in that way to help us get something done that we wanted to get done, and now look where we are.
You guys ready for questions? Okay, time for the audience to ask some questions. As you're coming up, let me remind you that we want questions, not comments, and sometimes folks want to tell what their opinion is, but we really want to hear the opinions of the panelists. So we're going to have people from each side of the aisle, so to speak. And since there are many more over to my right, let's start with you, sir. Your question.
The U.S. Supreme Court never ruled that you can't pray in public schools. As long as there's tests, there's going to be prayer. But they ruled that the state cannot make you pray in a state-sponsored manner. But I bet many of the people in this audience don't realize that distinction because it's rarely made. And I realized it in high school when I was debating. And it seemed, my question is about, this was how a misapprehension of the Supreme Court has been promulgated over about 50 years. And maybe there were other ones that, before my sentience kicked in, that I don't know about. So I'm wondering, we talked about some of the causes, you guys talked about some of the causes. Is this, I've always thought that this was a cause, but would you agree with that or not? Or are there other ones before then that I'm unaware of? That we've let, that not we, but that the country has a misapprehension of what the Supreme Court really said?
Well, I would agree that most people don't understand that prayer in school is still a complicated matter in which there is no absolute ban on it. But what we're talking about is a plan to organize godly Christians. And if you may have heard the Left Behind series by Tim LaHaye and Jerry B. Jenkins. Before they wrote novels, they wrote what they called fact-based material. And LaHaye wrote, the attack on the family, the attack on the public schools, and so there is a conspiracy theory that public education itself was a plot to take God out of America, and the evidence of that was all sorts of things. Taking Bible verse out of the readers. The McGuffey readers originally had Bible verse, and then they were old stories. And that was seen as the beginning of the de-Christianization of America. And so it's not so much that Americans don't understand the fine points of this legal issue, it's that there's about 15% of the electorate, when they leave the polls, says they're part of the Christian right, and their worldview is shaped by this claim that prayer has been taken out of schools, abortion is murder, when you marry, it was Adam and Eve, not Steve and Steve, and all of this stuff is part of a program to take back America as a Christian nation, but the MacGuffin there is America was not set up as a Christian nation, especially because the people who wrote those founding documents knew it would create schisms and conflict, as Ike pointed out. I mean, they were coming out of the experience of how bad it was before the Treaty of Westphalia and the kinds of battles that went on in Europe and the fact that many people of religion came here to flee religious oppression. So this is part of an ideological campaign being played out through religious organizations.
I think it's also partly a panic campaign. One of the things that's important to realize is that the religious right is actually in decline in America, slowly, and what is rapidly on the increase is the number of young people who claim no religious identity whatsoever. So one of the things we're getting is, I think, a kind of, if not yet the death throes, a kind of a panic reaction to seeing the culture go in a different direction.
Your question?
Hi, yes. My question is about Mormonism and how much is that is part of the missionary movement around the world, and how I heard it's also the largest, fastest growing religion around the world. And the last question is that I heard that Romney's father was born in Mexico because his grandfather was a polygamist. And how come none of this stuff is part of the discussion?
Well, I have to say that, my grandfather, who was in the silk business in Patterson, I can't be held accountable for that. So I don't think it's fair to say, well, his grandfather was a polygamist. Mormonism is certainly an evangelical form of Christianity. It's the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. As part of their religion, they send everyone out on mission for at least a year. All over the world. They are the fastest growing evangelical, fastest growing Christian denomination. I have been at meetings of the Christian right at the Values Voters Summit where evangelical Christians have said openly that they think Mormonism is a cult. And so it's very interesting to see the fact now that more, if you poll Democrats and Republicans as to what they think of Mormonism, a very sharp switch has occurred. There are more Democrats who think Mormonism is a cult than Republicans. And I think that this is a sort of an instrumental kind of view of the election that they're facing. But there's no doubt that Mormonism has a very strong missionary activity, and there's no doubt that all the way back through history, there have been missions put out that have been very constructive and helpful, and missions that have been arms of U.S. Imperialism. And if you look at the role of the Rockefellers funding the translation of Bibles into various tongues in Latin America, right before they decided they needed to exploit ore and oil, there was a direct relationship there. So people have to be clear that religious tolerance has to be also matched with an understanding of the specific practical goals of each religion and each sector of each religion today, which is very wide. I mean, there were people in Catholicism who are working with labor unions and poor people, and there are people like Rick Santorum who want to take us back to before the Enlightenment.
Your question?
Actually, I just want to add something really fast, which is that domestically, Mormonism is also diversifying incredibly fast. And so before, this goes back to Peter's initial comment that some folks who might never through their own life experience have come to embrace or be comfortable with diversity now have to because of the increasingly non-Anglo face of Mormonism. So to me, that's a great example of how religion giveth and religion taketh away.
And your question?
Yes. The Republican Party and the Tea Party, the religious right rather, and the Tea Party seem so tied to the Republican Party. I am wondering if that was a deliberate effort on the part of the Republican Party establishment a few years ago as a way to attack Democrats that has perhaps since gotten out of hand and is coming back to bite them because they are a lot more conservative than the establishment would like them to be. And I am wondering if y'all could address that, and if you do agree with that, is there any actual evidence in favor of that idea?
I've written a bunch of journal articles and I have chapters in several books on this dynamic. One's coming out from UC Berkeley on the Tea Party. What happened is very clear that the Republican Party over a number of years saw that it had its most reliable core base in the Christian right, and that's moved the party to the right. There's no doubt that's true. What happened with the Tea Party movement is that it started out as AstroTurf, fake grassroots, top-down. It was a funded project of right wing of the Republican Party, and it had no mass base. But lo and behold, as surprising to the sociologists as everyone else, it became an actual mass movement. It started out libertarian, mostly drawing from Ron Paul devotees. And as time went on, the right-wing funders and the Christian right grassroots people eventually took over the direction of the Tea Party. So it's not that it's vanished, it's that it was basically taken over by the Christian right. I don't think this was a conscious plan. It was too haphazard and chaotic as it happened. But they're not going to miss the opportunity to see the advantage for the election. And so what nobody knows, because you can't tease it out in the kind of polling that's been done, if 15% of the electorate is traditionally Christian right, and the Christian right has taken over part of the Tea Party, how much of the Tea Party represents new voters, and how much does it represent old Christian right voters who are just calling themselves something else? And we don't know. We won't know until the election votes are counted whether there is a whole lot of new angry people who are going to vote Republican and flip a coin. I don't think the outcome of this upcoming election is knowable, and people who are predicting it, I think, are quite foolish. We would have been one terrorist attack blamed on Islam or the left, or one economic downturn away from electing a Santorum in a brokered election.
And we have to appreciate the irony that's here. It's I was reading a humorous thing saying it's a tough time to be a right-wing bigot because they're faced between a choice between a Mormon and a black guy in the coming election.
Okay. Thanks for that. Okay, your question?
My question is, you were talking about how association with the religious right is in decline, but I think as we can all see, the ability of the religious right to mobilize and to yell louder than everybody else is, it seems to increase every day. So my question is, because religion and religious discourse and ideology has sort of taken so much of Washington and sort of manifests itself into policymaking and into, politicians' campaigns, and they're saying, we believe this, so they're trying to associate themselves with those voters. But anyways, I'm just trying to figure out, where do you see this increasing separatism in terms of we want to separate ourselves from these other people? Where do you see that going, and how as citizens can we start to re-secularize, if you want to call it that, our government?
So I alluded to this a little bit, and I'll tell a couple more stories, because the only way to do it is going to be showing that electorally it doesn't work. And the way to do that is, first, I mentioned the case where the American Muslim community in Northern Virginia thinks that it won an election. There was an even more interesting case in Michigan where there was a contested Republican gubernatorial primary. And one of the candidates was a gentleman who had been a member of Congress for a while and who had been very aggressive when there was talk about closing Guantanamo and bringing the prisoners to an unused U.S. prison. There are a lot of empty prisons in northern Michigan, and there was an effort to bring them there. And this congressman used a lot of really nasty racist rhetoric to try to prevent that from happening. And so then he ran for governor. And Michigan, as you may know, has a very large American Muslim population. Folks started coming almost 100 years ago to work in the auto industry from Lebanon. So some of the leadership of that community got together and said, look, we're not going to let this guy be nominated. And prominent, wealthy businessmen, mostly, and they went to other Republican candidates and said, look, we want to find someone to support. And one Republican candidate was courageous enough to say, yes, I'll take your money. I'm not afraid of being called a tool of the Muslim Brotherhood. You laugh, but unfortunately that's not funny. And lo and behold, he's the guy who won the nomination, and he's the governor of Michigan. And I know we don't like him on a whole bunch of domestic social issues, but that community was able to organize itself and keep someone who had gone after it out of office. And to me, the first step is, how can various affected religious communities, including the progressive religious community, which is kind of quiet and is embarrassed because we know our secular progressive friends are ashamed of us, how can we demonstrate, and how can we get, you mentioned, Ike, also the Quran burning pastor in Florida. And that was a horrible moment, and it did have really terrible repercussions on the ground, but it also was a real moment of revulsion that Americans who don't regularly tune into this issue said, hey, wait a minute, this is gross, this is not who we are. And so how can we, it's not like I want to have more of those moments, but how can we use those moments and really turn the tide and make people see that this has gone far beyond sort of the normal discomfort that everyone has with people who are different. So I think there's actually a lot of scope for success, but it does require organization, focus, and some politicization of work that people would generally sort of rather not be political about.
I also think that progressive religious people are too polite, and I'm a bit of a heretic among, I think we more often need to not get drowned out, because we're actually a sizable group, and we need to say that things are nuts when they're nuts, and to enter into that public space that we way too often leave wide open to the most strident and extreme part of the Christian right.
Thanks. Over here, your question?
Yeah, so, sorry. When you mentioned that when a politician makes their religion, just puts it out in public, anything public technically can be considered a governmental affair. Wouldn't that be completely going against the separation of church and state that we're kind of striving for equality in our government?
I think the answer is yes. If I understand the question properly, I think that was that was the heart of my point. When religion enters into the public sphere, particularly in public policy, public policies, the whole idea of it being a public policy, not a private policy, what is inferred in the public piece is some action on behalf of government, a requirement, right? Whether it's government having an obligation to take an action to regulate itself on behalf of protecting liberty, to include religious freedom and religious liberty, or government being obligated constitutionally to take action more in line with the 14th Amendment's equal protection under the law clause. So for me, maybe this is overly simplistic. If you care about freedom of religion, keep it in the private sphere, right? I mean, there's an increasing incident among my cadets at West Point, and frankly, some of the faculty, where it ranges from email signatures with, the I am second type of signature closings, and even in the classroom declaring oneself. We do it on the political side too. We're so intent on labeling ourselves and throwing ourselves into a particular box. I'm a realist and I'm a evangelical Christian or a Catholic or whatever. Okay. What I care about is that you're an Army officer that serves the Constitution, right? And protects and defends the Constitution and a republic. And you declaring that is unallowable, because if only for the perception that you may be feeding, that you, as the commissioned officer that you're soon to become, you may transmit to either 51% or 49% of the public that you're either for them and of them only, right? And you don't declare an oath to support and defend the Constitution, only the red parts or only the blue parts or only the faith-based parts and not the secular parts. That's not what we do.
And your question?
Yes. I guess I was just sort of wondering, I know there was some dispute about, faith and its marriage with NGOs, but do any of you see a way that faith-based groups could go out and, try and help people and not be silent about the fact that they're faith-based, but not add to the contributing of human strife?
Yeah, I guess I opened that one up too, didn't I? I can appear in a public servant, horrible word, business, a profession, vocation, right? Why is it so important to find a yes answer to the part of your question where, is there any way we can find where we can actually go out and do the good works and label it? Now, compliments of the Southern Baptist Coalition, right? Or compliments of Protestant Evangelicals International. I'm making up labels now. But you get my meaning, right? I mean, if you're a servant and you're in the service, it's to be about the service. And why, and particularly if we understand by really wanting maybe to add that label because it makes us feel good about ourselves, that I'm compromising the servitude, all right? I'm compromising the good works. In the picture we're painting to you, there are real dramatic consequences that in just whispering compliments of Protestant evangelicals, or we're picking on Protestant evangelicals, but it's across the board. that little extra can compromise the whole sense of the mission and the accomplishment of the mission, right? I mean, it's very similar in my vocation as a professional military officer, you know, in Iraq and Afghanistan. All of the works that I had a hand in crafting and implementing and leading, if we're talking about COIN counterinsurgency, population-centric COIN, everything we did, we gave full credit to the people, even if they didn't have any hand in it, and we didn't leave any labels on things. We did in the first few years, until a few of us were able to raise alert that that was compromising the whole sense of the service, and so we started pulling labels off of things, right? I would offer it's very similar. Focus on, I mean, there are so many good works being done by all of these actors, including the true to form traditional missionaries and these religious-based NGOs. What I'm offering them is you can get your good works done well and not compromise the mission and compromise your own security and safety by not putting the label, by being the sacrificing servant and saying, let the good work speak for itself.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
I actually want to push back on that because I'm involved with, there's an international service committee. I just got back from Japan where relief work, I was there helping to celebrate really memorialize on the 1-year anniversary of the tsunami where my religious organization had provided aid. I think the critical thing is there's no proselytizing going on. We did it, in fact, and gave the money through largely Shinto and Buddhist local organizations who were the best in position to distribute it in a humanitarian way. And they didn't have any problem knowing that it came from a religious organization. So the key is not the labeling, I think, as much as, yeah, we did it, here it is, we do it because, you know, we're brothers and sisters on this planet, end of story. So it's the proselytizing that becomes the problem.
I agree with that. I mean, you can see the gray here, the gray space that we have to negotiate, we have to talk about, and that's the beauty of this kind of panel. But I would add, we have to think about the perception, the perceived proselytization, which could come from a simple labeling. Unintended. No intention to proselytize, but we have to calculate into the calculation the receiver and how that message is being received or how it could possibly be received and misperceived. All right, so that's the balance we have to figure out.
And your question?
Yeah, I watched all the Republican debates, and yeah, I did. And anyway, you guys are talking about the labels and letting the good works just show, which would be great if our candidates would do the same thing. So many of the candidates paraded their alleged religious beliefs across the national stage. So I think I think I've been hearing you all say, once you've done that, your alleged religious beliefs are fair game. And I have a real problem with the way many of the candidates define pro-life. Many of them are pro-fetus, but they're not pro-life. And so, since they've made their alleged religious beliefs, put it out there, labeled it, wouldn't it be wise for others who aren't doing that to call them out on it, to call them out on the hypocrisies? I mean, I think they're fair game.
So, speaking as someone who also watched most of the debates, I keep a foam brick in my house. They're great. You can order them online from clown supply stores. Took a minute to sink in. The thing that I think we have to keep in mind that's really difficult about this is that there's such an element of theater about it and of targeted theater to targeted audiences. And, but at the same time, Ike has laid out the way that there are now other audiences for the plays that we have to amuse ourselves. So those debates, they didn't care what you thought about their religious beliefs. They were, full of dog whistles and specific theological references designed to appeal to particular subtexts in particular communities. So I don't even know, and I feel this way on the national security issues, which is what I was watching the debates for. I don't even know, hypocrisy is not a useful term in our politics anymore. I think you just have to let that go. I don't know how to talk about hypocrisy anymore in our politics. But I do think this comes back to what we said earlier, that it's perfectly reasonable, and I wish we did it more, for other people to be out there. And frankly, the pro-life battle, we lost that battle 20 years ago. The idea that there's a notion of life that means caring about the baby after it's born. But we lost that one 20 years ago. We got to find a different way to try to put it forward. And so rather than saying you're a hypocrite for saying what you believe, I think it's much actually better to be on the offense instead of the defense, and to be saying, this is how, as you said right at the beginning, this is how my faith, this is how our faith informs our values, this is how our values inform our politics, and these are the policies that we think are best for the country. Why don't you have policies that address these issues? And don't try to play hypocrisy, because it just doesn't exist anymore.
So we have only a few minutes left, and we have 2 questions, and so those will be the last questions. So I think we're on this side, so you're next.
Hi, as a product of the complement of the whatever church that brought me here to America from a United Nations refugee camp program, where of course I had to literally be baptized in order to come to America. My question to the panel is, do you think that we're approaching the end game or the apocalypse, war, the crusade? Is this what we're approaching? Or the Republicans or whatever, are they trying to push us towards that?
Well, no one ever lost a bet saying the apocalypse wasn't going to happen. That's a joke, think about it. So do some of the people who are most active in the Christian right believe that we are living in the end times? Yes. They think the state of Israel's creation set the clock ticking. They look around and see the signs of the times and everywhere. And the Left Behind series is a series of novels that talk about how the really, really, really good Christians get raptured up, but the only so-so Christians are left behind and have to prove themselves. So yes, the apocalyptic thinking and apocalyptic millennialism is an aspect of the rituals of purification. If in fact we're in the end times, then when you hear a politician or somebody talk about the principalities and powers, I'm going to bet most of you have no idea what that means. What it means is that in the end times, the good Christian rise up against the satanic agents of the principalities and powers. So that's a dog whistle to apocalyptic and millennialist Christians. It may be, but it's a dog whistle for this apocalyptic group of people who think that Obama's on the side of Satan. So I'm afraid, yes, I was at Boston University with the Center for Millennial Studies. Yes, a lot of these folks who are going to vote against Obama are doing so that they think he is a satanic agent of the Antichrist in the end times. And if you think I'm kidding, there was a poll a few years ago of Republicans in New Jersey where 15% said that they thought it was possible that Obama was the Antichrist. Wait for it, 14% were sure of it.